Hi, this is Woodwork Designs by Z, and today I'm going to be building some mid-century modern nightstands for my aunt and gifting them to her for her 50th birthday. Keep watching to see what happens. The design for the nightstands are a walnut box with 2 drawers and patterned plywood drawer fronts. I first start out by making the patterned plywood. I break down a sheet of Baltic birch plywood with my track saw. Then I use a piece of 3/4 inch plywood that I had laying around to make a test sample, so that way I can make sure all the angles are right. I need to set the table saw blade to 30 degrees for this. As you can see, all the angles were just right, so I move on to cutting the actual piece of Baltic birch plywood. As you can see, I make a lot of strips, because I didn't quite know how to calculate the exact number of pieces I would need for the patterned plywood. I thought I made way too many at this point. Then I cross-cut all the strips down to 12 inches because they would be way easier to glue up as 1-foot sections instead of 5-foot sections. Here's all the strips I made. There's a lot of them. Then I use some blue painter's tape to tape the pieces together, so that way I can roll them up into hexagons. Then I glue all the strips. I need to make sure I get plenty of glue in these strips because the end grain of the plywood loves to absorb the glue. I use a rocker glue brush to spread the glue around and get it into all the little crevices. I want to make sure these pieces have a good bond so that they don't break. Then, as you can see, I roll up the strips and I use rubber bands to clamp them. It's the best way to clamp all the strips evenly together. I ended up running out of rubber bands midway through gluing up these pieces. So I waited for those pieces to dry, then took the rubber bands off of them and used them to glue up the other ones. After that, when the glue was dry, I pulled off all the rubber bands and the tape. This surprisingly took a while. Then I scraped off the glue. I should have done this a little bit earlier so that it wasn't so hard to scrape off, but I waited a little too long and it took a while to scrape off all the glue. Then I used the drum sander to sand all the edges of the strips. I made sure to sand each edge about evenly so that way they would all fit together, because if one strip is a different size than the rest, then they won't fit together properly. After that, I made a bunch of little mini pucks. These then get glued together into the panels. Here you can see me laying out each one of the little individual pucks. Each one of these pucks have to be laid in the exact right orientation and flipped the right way, otherwise the panel will not look right. Then I glued up the panels. Each one of these panels has 228 little mini pucks, and I had to get glue on each one of them. It took a while, like 30 minutes per panel, so I sprayed the panels down with water from a spray bottle to keep the glue from drying too quickly. It actually worked surprisingly well. To clamp these, I used wedges and a couple of clamps to keep the form from spreading apart. The wedges allow me to get good, even clamping pressure along all the panels. After that, once the glue was dry, I took them out of the clamps. If anyone's wondering where I learned how to make the patterned plywood, it was from watching YouTube videos. Then I drum sanded the panels flat. After that, I moved on to working on the legs. I started off by ripping down some 8/4 walnut that I had left over from another project. Then I planed down the pieces of walnut to just over 1.5 inches thick. This is because the legs dimensions are going to be a final thickness of 1.5 inches, and I wanted to be able to take these over to the drum sander after planing them, because the drum sander leaves a nicer finish than the planer. I first drum sanded them with 80 grit. Then I switched the paper to 150 and I drum sand them with that. This will minimize the sanding with the random orbital sander later. Then I moved on to cutting the angles for the legs. This angle wasn't 45 degrees, it was some weird angle because the legs splay out. To cut the longer pieces, I first cut it on one side, then using a template I had made for the legs, I mark it and I cut the other side. Then I mark out where I'm going to add dominoes to the joint. I make sure to label all the pieces so I know which ones go together afterward. I then add dominoes to all the joints. This will help with strength and alignment for this miter. I believe I used an 8mm domino for these joints, but I can't quite remember. I added 2 dominoes to each leg piece. Here you can see that the dry assembly went well. All the pieces fit together the right way they were supposed to. To allow me to clamp these angles, I used the offcuts from cutting the angles into the pieces, and I CA glued them directly to the pieces of walnut. I then applied the glue, stuck in the dominoes, and stuck the pieces together. One of the clamping coils came off, but I glued it back on and just kept going. I make sure to wipe off the joint as much of the glue as possible, so that way I don't have to clean that up later. I then remove all the clamps, and to remove those blocks, I just hit them with a hammer and they pop right off. It doesn't matter if it tears a little bit of the grain out, because now, I'm going to flush trim them. I first start out by using a router bit with a top-mounted bearing. It's upside down in a router table, so it looks like it'd be a bottom-mounted bearing. At some point, I had to remake my template because the old template, the 2 legs were different angles. I don't know how I managed that one. Then I switched the router table over to a flush trim bit with a bottom-mounted bearing, and I flip the pieces over after removing the template. I then clean up that little bit that's left. Afterward, I take those pieces over to the drum sander. I do this so that way I can clean up the faces of all the pieces and make sure they were perfectly flush. They're very close because I used dominoes to glue them. After that, I start working on the actual cabinet part of the nightstands. I first cut down some pieces of walnut plywood with my track saw. I had a little bit left over from another project a long time ago that I was able to use. Then I had to get out a giant 4x8 sheet of plywood. I cut all the pieces oversized so that I could then cut them down to their final size on the table saw. After that, I start working on edge banding for those pieces. I rip some walnut with the table saw. This walnut edge banding is 1 inch big. And you might be saying that's really big for edge banding, but I'm going to add a cool chamfer detail to the front, and I need that thicker edge banding. After that, I drum sand the pieces. Then I glue on the pieces of edge banding. I spread the glue on, and then I use some of these Rockler bandy clamps to hold the pieces on. I had clamps along the edges to help keep the pieces flush to the plywood. Then I use painter's tape to actually hold the pieces on. I should have used clamps instead because these were so big and couldn't conform to any little imperfections in the plywood. After that, I sand all the edge banding. I have to be careful to not sand through the veneer of the plywood. I then set the table saw blade to 45 degrees, and I cut all of the pieces for the boxes. These pieces are grain matched with a waterfall edge so that the grain continues up one side across the top and down the other side. There were a lot of pieces to cut because I'm making 2 nightstands. I then set the table saw blade to 90, and I make sure to check both sides just in case there's imperfections in the table or something. I then cross-cut all of the pieces to the right width, forward and backward. I then add dominoes to the pieces for the miters. I don't need to do this, but I figured why not. To get the dominoes on the edges, I use the indexing tabs that are provided on the domino. Then, for the ones in the middle, I use the larger indexing tabs that you can add to the domino. Then I do a dry fit. I put all the dominoes in, and I assemble the entire box. This is so I can make sure that everything's fitting together properly before doing the glue up. Thankfully, everything was fitting together just right. Then I set that off to the side and went back to working on the legs. I first start out by marking out where the mortises need to go for the two halves of the legs to fit together. It was a little tricky to figure out, but in the end I got it. I then used a Japanese pull saw to cut the mortises into the legs and a file to clean them up and make them perfect. After that, I took the other half of the legs and I set them into that mortise to mark them out. Then I took those over to the table saw and I could use that to cut these mortises. I'll admit, the ones when I cut it with the table saw came out a little better than the ones when I cut them with the Japanese pull saw. But since you can never see it unless you flip the nightstands over, they're just fine. Then I made sure to give all the legs a good round over. Then I cleaned up the bottoms of the legs with the table saw. After that, I added a chamfer around the bottom of the legs, so that way, when they're up against the floor, they won't tear out if you slide them. Because of that taper, I have to raise up the router bit and then do just the back of it. This is because the bearing reaches at a different point. Then I did some more sanding. A theme on this project is a lot of sanding. Then it was time to assemble the legs. I had to add a couple of shims into these because some of the mortises were just slightly too deep. After the glue was dry, I took the clamps off. Then I went back to working on the actual boxes. I pulled them apart, and I made sure to remove all the dominoes. These dominoes go in a lot easier than they come out. After that, I added a rabbet to the back of the boxes, so that way when I put in the back panel, it sits flush. Then I added that chamfer detail I was talking about to the front. You'll see it's a little bit better in some later clips. Then I pre-sanded the inside of all the panels. And I made sure to sand the chamfer detail on the front as well. Then I moved on to finishing. The finish I'm using is Rubio Monocoat. It gets mixed up in a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 parts finished to 1 part hardener. The reason I'm finishing the insides of the panels now is because it's so much easier than after it's assembled. The finish gets poured on and spread around one of those Bondo spreaders. Then I use an old random orbital sander I had, and I put a white Scotch-Brite pad on it. I use that to buff it in to the pieces of wood. After that, I wipe it all off with a paper towel. You can't wipe off too much, but you can leave too much on. Once the finish is dry, I use some more blue tape and I tape off the insides of the miters. This is so that when they're squeezed out from gluing up the panels, I can just peel the painter's tape up and the squeeze out will come with it. I glued up the panels. Also, I made sure to put glue into the domino holes as well because those dominoes will actually provide a little bit of strength to the miter. This glue up took a while, not quite as long as gluing up the pattern plywood, so I didn't have to spray the glue with water or anything. After putting all the glue on, I clamped the panels. I shouldn't have clamped it so close to the edge. It did mess up the project a little bit later. Then I checked the boxes for square. Best to adjust them now because I won't be able to adjust them later once the glue is dry. Once the glue was dry, all the clamps came off and I was able to peel the tape up. You can't see it here, but there's no squeeze out on the inside because of that tape. Then I sanded the outside of the boxes. This is when I realized my mistake. Because I glued the edge banding on with painter's tape, and then putting those clamps so close to that edge, it pushed one of the pieces of edge banding down on the top, which made me sand through the veneer on the plywood. You'll see how I fixed that a little bit later. Then, because of this plywood on the back that's exposed, I glue on just a little bit of thin walnut edge banding. This is a great application for the painter's tape. After that, I cut the backs to the right size. I'm just using a little bit of 1/4-inch walnut plywood for this. This plywood was left over from another project as well. After ripping it, I then cross-cut it to the right size using my new cross-cut sled. If the backs were any bigger, I would have had to go out and buy a whole new sheet of walnut plywood. I'm thankful they weren't, and this was a complete accident that it ended up being this way. After that, I sanded the backs, or the inside of them. This is so I can pre-finish them before I install them. I did pre-finish them, but I'm not showing it here because I have enough finishing clips and it's kind of boring. So I'm moving on to gluing in the backs. I also made sure to tape off where the backs get glued in so that the glue will adhere to it. Then I puttied the backs. There were a couple of small gaps, and I just filled those with a little bit of walnut putty. I then sanded all the putty smooth. Then I moved on to finishing the bottoms of the boxes. The reason I'm finishing these now is because then I can install the legs. I also finished the legs at this point. This is the exact same finishing process as before. Although I did 2 coats, and that's possible with Rubio Monocoat, you just have to scuff it up with a maroon Scotch-Brite pad in between coats. Also, the sander isn't put on full power at this point when you do that. Then you can just apply a second coat like normal, and it makes it look so much better. Although, just know you won't need as much finish for the second coat. After that, I install the legs. I make sure that they're in the exact right spot they need to be. Then I trace out where they go so that I can drill out for screws. You might be saying to yourself, why are you using screws on this piece of fine furniture? Because you're never going to see them. They're on the inside of the box underneath the drawers, and you'd have to remove the drawers to find them. And here you can see where I had sanded through the veneer. I fixed it by taking a piece of veneer off of a piece of plywood that I had left over from earlier and gluing it on. This patch looked okay in the end, and where it is in the bedroom up against the bed, you can't see it, especially once the finish goes on. To sand it, I use a piece of sandpaper wrapped around a machinist block to make sure it's perfectly flat. Then I move on to installing drawer slides. I have to make sure these are spaced back 3/4 of an inch to allow for the drawer fronts. It's okay if they're not perfect because the drawer fronts are a little bit big at this point, and I plan to sand them down to the right thickness later. I then screw in the drawer slides. I'm using Blum undermount drawer slides here. These drawer slides are full extension and soft close, which is really nice. Then I start working on the drawers. For these drawers, I'm using basswood. I would have preferred to use maple, which is way harder, but I had the basswood laying around the shop, and these drawers aren't going to get a lot of abuse. I first start by resawing the basswood on the table saw. These panels were way thicker than I needed them, and I can get 2 drawer slides out of each panel. I then take them over to the drum sander and I sand them down to the right thickness. This went pretty quickly because the basswood is so soft. After that, I add a groove into the bottom of each panel. This is so I can add the drawer bottom later. I then took them over to the router table, and using a rounder bit, I added a profile. Then the 4 backs of each drawer got the bottom cut off. This is so I can slide in the panel after they're made. I'm using rabbets to assemble these drawers, so I then cut the rabbets. After that, I sanded the inside of these drawer boxes. Again, it's easier to sand them now before they're glued up. For the drawers, I'm using a different finish than before. I'm using a water-based poly, and I first roll it on and then use a foam brush to wipe it off. This gave me an excellent finish. After that, I'm marking out where I'm going to drill out for plugs and screws to assemble these drawers. I don't have much room here because these drawer boxes are only 1/2 inch thick, but I'll make it work. I then use a Forstner bit to drill out where the plugs go. And then I use a brad point bit to drill out for the screws. After that, I assemble these drawer boxes. A little bit of glue, some screws, and the drawer boxes are complete. I make sure to wipe out the inside so that there's no glue. I then use some pre-finished birch plywood I had in the shop for the bottoms. This is great because I don't have to finish it myself. Then the bottoms get slid into the drawers. Now you can see why I had to cut the bottom of the backs of the drawers off. These panels were a little bit hard to get in, but I got them in the end. I'm not gluing them in because they don't need to be. I just put a couple of screws into the back from the bottom. After that, I made a bunch of walnut plugs. I used a CMT plug cutter. It's honestly the best plug cutter, and if you've never tried it, you should get one. I had to make a lot of plugs for this. I then pop the plugs out with a screwdriver. I don't need to resaw it and cut the plugs out because the plugs don't need to be perfect. I then glue in all the little plugs. After the glue dries, I use a little flush trim saw to cut the plugs flush. I have to be careful here so I don't accidentally mar the wood because the bass is so soft, it scratches and mars easily. I then sand all the plugs flush and sand the outsides of the drawer boxes. I also give the bottoms a quick sanding. Then I install these Blum clips. I don't know why I decided to do this before finishing, but it's okay because I'm not actually planning to finish the bottoms. These clips are how the drawer boxes actually attach to the drawer slides. Then I had to drill a small hole in the back of the drawer boxes. This doesn't go all the way through the drawer boxes onto the inside, but this is so that the drawer boxes can connect to the drawer slides in the back. After that, I put the drawer boxes into the nightstands just to test and make sure it's all working. I then apply finish to the outsides of the drawer boxes. It's the same water-based poly as before. After that, I had to fix an error in one of the pieces of pattern plywood. I'm thankful that there's only one error because I had to glue up 228 little pucks for both panels. To fix this, I first traced out where the puck is, and then I drilled out with a Forstner bit. This leaves a round hole, and I need a hexagon-shaped hole, so I use a jigsaw to get much closer to the line. Then I use some files to clean it up. I think at some point I also used a utility knife, but I'm not showing it here. Then the new piece could get glued into the hole. It was a pretty tight fit, which was perfect because there was no gaps, and in the end, you could never see where I fixed it. I couldn't even find my own mistake, which is very rare. Once the glue is dry, I used the same flush cut saw as before to cut the new puck flush. I then sanded it to make it disappear. After that, I had to cut the panels down to their proper size. This pattern plywood was surprisingly hard to cut through. I think it's because of all the resins and glues. Another thing to know about it is it's actually not particularly strong when bent, and it can break. I also cut the panels directly in half. This is because these are actually two drawer fronts, and the reason I made them as one panel is so that way they line up together. I then sanded the panel with some 150 grit on the drum sander. This is to get them down to the exact right thickness and fit perfectly in the nightstands. I then installed the panels onto the nightstands. The reason I'm assembling everything before finish is so that way I can tweak it now, then apply the finish and just assemble it later. I used playing cards to get the exact right spacers. This is a great trick, and you can just measure out even amounts of playing cards and just keep adding them until you get everything evenly spaced. I went with a 3/32 inch gap for these nightstands. It was the exact right gap, which made everything look perfect and the pattern line up between the two drawer fronts. This is also a terrible camera angle because I'm standing in front of the camera most of the time, but I didn't have a better camera angle. To install the drawer fronts, I screw through the hole that the knob gets installed in. This is so that way I can then pull the drawer fronts out and screw them in from the back side. After that, I carefully removed all the playing cards. These drawer fronts will still pivot if you're not careful. Then I screwed in the drawer fronts. And I checked to make sure everything was perfect. Then I screwed it in the rest of the way on the other sides. After that, I removed the screw that held the drawer front on temporarily. Then I could install the knob. These drawer fronts just got a simple brass knob. I was going to go with a flush-mounted brass pole, but I couldn't find one that would come in time, and that was a reasonable price. But these knobs turned out great, and I'm glad I went with them. Then I apply finish to the outsides of the cabinets in the drawer fronts. It's the same process as before with the Rubio Monocoat, and I did 2 coats on this as well. Then I reassembled everything. Thanks to those Blum drawer slides, the drawers just click right into place. It makes reassembly so easy. Then I put the drawer fronts back on. They went on so much easier this time because they'd already been on once, and everything went right back where it was. Then the knobs went on. Everything's looking so good at this point. Also, if you've made it this far in the video, then you probably enjoy this, so please consider subscribing. At some point, I switched over to using my impact driver. It was way more efficient, although I had to be careful to not strip out any of the screws. And now for the reveal. Check out those really cool pattern plywood drawer fronts and the brass knobs. Also, I love the way the walnut looks on the nightstands. And the plugs on the sides of the drawers. It almost looks like the drawers were built with dowel joinery. I'm really happy with the way these turned out, and my aunt is too. She loved them for her birthday. Thanks for watching.